Welcome to Straight from the Gavel. I'm your host, Dave Barber, coming to you from the lounge of the Rhode Island House of Representatives. Each and every week at this time, we like to invite a member of the General Assembly in to discuss many of the things that happen in this building and its impact on you, the Rhode Island citizen. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome back a gentleman we've had the pleasure of interviewing before, and he also is part of the Republican leadership team here in the House of Representatives. He is the Minority House Leader, the Honorable Brian Newberry. Representative, Leader, good to see you.
Hi, Dave. How are you?
Welcome back. And again, you folks in the House have, right out of the gate, have been very busy. And obviously, as the session progresses, and now pretty much well underway, Speaker Fox has made it clear that the economy is job one. And is that a top priority among you and your Republican colleagues as well?
Well, I think it's the top priority. And it's not that it's the only issue we should be addressing, but it's the only one that should be a priority. In my 5 years in the building, since I first got elected, the economy's been in recession nationally, essentially, maybe not technically, but in effect in recession since I got elected. Much of that has to do with I would say inept leadership in Washington, but that's a separate topic. In Rhode Island, though, our state economy, even relative to the rest of the country, is poor, and that's a serious problem. I think everyone knows that.
You know, recently I had one of your colleagues from the other side of the aisle, Representative Jan Malik, on a Capitol Spotlight segment, where he talked about the idea of eliminating the sales tax here in Rhode Island as a tool of making us more viable, making us more competitive with our neighboring communities. And he honestly told a story about how he owns a business near the border and how he feels that he loses business. How do you feel about that sales tax idea?
Well, you know, it's an issue that I raised myself last fall in the sort of pre-session interviews with the press. Conceptually, I'd love to see us get rid of the sales tax. As a practical matter, you know, can it be done? Probably not in one session. Could it be something we can phase out over a period of time? We could. I mean, when you start talking about the sales tax, there's philosophical issues about whether or not an income tax is the best way to raise revenue, a sales tax is the best way to raise revenue. Rhode Island, of course, our taxes are high in general. My point is, although I tend to lean towards the view that an income tax is a better way of raising revenue anyway, when you're in a state geographically the size we are, you have to be at least competitive with your neighbors, and frankly, you can get an advantage if you're lower. I'd like to see it eliminated because the compliance costs for businesses are a huge part of it too. But even if we can start to reduce it, that's something I'd like to see done.
Well, the question that I asked him, and I'll ask you the same one. I think everybody watching this show right now would say, "Gosh, great! I'd love to be able to buy stuff and not have to pay sales tax. That's certainly a big savings, but we still have to administer the state and municipal services that people also rely on. So how do you make up that money?"
Well, here's the thing, and I've had our staff look at this issue and put together, I guess, a white paper, you would call it, for me. And here's the thing. Right now, the sales tax accounts for, and I'm using rough numbers here, about $900 million in revenue each year.
It's a lot of money.
It's an awful lot of money. It's about, well, we have about 3.3 billion that comes from the state side for our budget. It's, what is that, a little less than 25, a little more than 25%. However, you can start with some cuts in different areas. You cannot cut, as much as some people don't want to hear this, you cannot cut $900 million from our budget in 1 year. It's not going to happen. You can, however, start cutting here, there, and start putting in process programs that will reduce, for example, one idea that's been thrown out is consolidating fire districts that will lead to local savings, which will come from state coffers. The real kicker is this, though. You can't eliminate the sales tax or even reduce it substantially without offsetting some of the revenue loss by raising other taxes. There's no doubt about that. Anybody who thinks they can doesn't understand the way the budget works. I've looked at the income tax. Now, I've been a strong opponent of all these, I think, frankly, absurd and ideologically driven proposals to raise taxes on the so-called rich, okay? But if you look at the income tax as a whole, according to the fiscal office, for each 0.25% increase in the income tax, the state brings in about $50 million. So if you raise the income tax on everyone, not just the rich, but everybody by 1%, you could bring in about $200 million in revenue. If you did that and you could find $200 million in cuts, all of a sudden that $900 million sales tax hit comes down to $500 million. You're not eliminating it, but you're bringing the percentage down. It's a start. And I think if you've got people thinking that way, it's something we might be able to achieve over the course of several years.
What do you say, though, to the overwhelming majority of polls that say Americans want the rich to pay more? They feel that the rich should pay a larger share. And then you have guys like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett that say they want to pay more.
Well, they can always voluntarily pay more.
Well, but
actually, I have very little patience for billionaires who complain about how they don't pay enough in taxes. But putting that aside, I think when you say to people, should the rich pay more in taxes, and you're not one of the so-called rich, you think to yourself, well, yeah, that seems fair, but I think we need to remember a couple things. Number one, the rich do pay a lot more as it is. Their tax rates are higher in general than everybody else. And of course, in raw dollars, they pay a lot more. Secondly, when you start looking at the numbers, most proposals to tax the rich aren't hitting the rich. I remember during the pension debate 2 years ago, one of my colleagues put in a floor amendment that was supposed to eliminate the pension reform by raising more money. And his amendment would have raised income taxes on everyone making $125,000 or more. That's how he perceived the rich. Well, guess what? 2 top-step teachers make more than that. So that tax would have hit the middle class. Particularly in the Northeast Corridor, I think people's perceptions of what is rich versus what's really rich are not the same thing. There's very few truly wealthy people.
Well, you know, again, I just think if I were going to give advice to the and let's talk nationally for just a quick second, because the president has been out championing this, and he ran on that concept, and you know, 72% of the American population thinks the super rich should pay more. I think it would help your party if they were to say, hey, look it, real rich people should pay a little bit more. It's not going to be everybody realizes it's not going to solve the problem completely. But I think that there's there's a perception problem that exists.
Well, you know, you're right there is a perception problem. But what you're arguing for is making a political statement rather than a principled policy statement, really. Because you're right. There are not enough rich people in Rhode Island or in this country to tax to deal with our deficits, either the state level or the federal level. It makes people feel better to say we're going to do it. And from a purely political point of view, it's a safe and easy thing to say, just like Democrats tend to do, not all of them, but like some of them, like our president, tend to do. Let's just tax the rich people. It gains votes, but it doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And I'd rather do the right thing to do and try to explain to people why I think it's the right thing to do than do the cheap and easy out.
The only problem is on a national level, Republicans may keep losing elections if they keep doing that.
They might, but I'm not sure that's the reason why Republicans lose elections. I think there's a lot of things that go into national elections. For example, at the presidential level, for whatever reasons, President Obama draws out voters. It's not my cup of tea, so to speak, but he does. And I'm not sure it's because he advocates taxing the rich. I think he just draws voters out for
well, you know, I love talking about this with you because you have a real good grasp of this, and you're a pretty smart guy. I think the party nationally, the Republican Party nationally, has this dilemma that in order to win primary elections, they have to go after the most extreme right-wing faction of their party. And then the general election comes along, and a lot more people come to the dance, and consequently, they can't win.
Well, the Democrats have the same exact problem. Both parties at the national level do that. In fact, one of the biggest problems, I think, with politics in this country on a national level is the gerrymandering in Congress. If you look at the congressional districts across the country, there's very few relative to the whole that are competitive between the two parties. Almost all of them, you know, I would say 4/5 of them, it seems, are decided in the primaries, be it a Democratic primary or Republican primary. So you end up getting the winners being people from both sides. It's not a Republican issue, and frankly, I get annoyed when the press always talks about, well, the Republicans are riven by factions. So are the Democrats. I mean, look at this state. Can you tell me what the Democratic point of view is in this General Assembly? There's 69 Democrats in this House, and some of them are more conservative than me. So I find it interesting when people talk. I mean, I do. I find it interesting when people say the Republican Party has factions. Of course it does, just like the Democratic Party does. They're two major political parties. At the national level, they tend to swing back and forth. But when you have a system that encourages both parties to pander to the extreme elements, you get extreme politics on the national level.
Yeah, and I don't want to get too far off base here, too, talking about national politics, but I just think that when your national candidate in this last presidential election took some of the stands that he did, it's just completely out of sync of what the majority of polled Americans think.
You know what? I will agree with you on one point. That certainly some of the stands Mitt Romney took didn't help him, but I think the reason they didn't help him wasn't the stands he took, because people didn't believe he actually believed them. What I found with talking to constituents, even when people disagree with you, if they know you're respectful and they know you actually fully believe what you're saying, they'll respect that. And they may not like that particular position, but they'll let it go. But if they think you're pandering or you're saying what you think they want to hear, they don't like that at all.
And that was a charge levied at Mr. Romney. Yeah. We had a discussion about that the other day. Good people can indeed disagree, and I think you're exactly right on point. If the voter understands that you're passionate and sincere, even if they are a constituent of yours and maybe don't see that one particular issue your way, they understand that. I love the Ed Koch quotation that he used to use, and he said, if you agree with me 9 out of 12 times, vote for me. If you agree with me 12 out of 12 times, see a psychiatrist.
No, that's exactly it. I mean, he's right. He's right.
You know, let's get back to taxes in Rhode Island. There's been talk about the corporate tax as well. Maybe we could become more competitive and attract more business if we were to lower the corporate tax. There seems to be a lot of support for that.
Well, the governor's proposed cutting the corporate tax from 9% down to, I think it's 7%. But the thing to remember, and I support that, but the thing to remember about the corporate tax in Rhode Island is we're not talking about S corporations and LLCs, we're talking about larger C corporations. And so it's not going to affect that many small businesses, it's going to affect the larger ones. It's a good thing, it's certainly not going to hurt the state, it's only be a boon to the state. But I would like to see us do that, but I'd also like to see us look at cutting the corporate minimum tax. There's a lot of small business people. In fact, there's a member of this assembly, I don't want to say who it is because I'm sure they'll not be thrilled I mentioned the name on TV, but there's a member of this assembly that told me they pay $1,500 every year because they have 3 separate small business corporations that they operate. $1,500 is an awful lot of money for a small businessman. For what purpose? I'd like to see us at least reduce that as well. So I'd like to see us do both. Because let's not forget, corporations don't actually pay taxes. They simply pass the cost on to people.
You know, again, you're exactly right. And that goes into their cost of doing business. Recently, you folks in the House held a 5-hour economic summit that brought in some of the real good economic and business minds in the community to share ideas and exchange concepts and do an analysis of what's going on here in Rhode Island, especially with business regulation. Do you get the sense, Leader, that we're making progress? Do you think, is Rhode Island moving the needle in the right direction?
Yes, but not fast enough. I mean, in my time here, we've done some good things. The personal income tax reform of 2010, I think, was a very good boost long-term. When I talk to small business people, and I've said this repeatedly, I've said this probably on your show before and other shows and to my constituents, regulatory relief is very important in this state.
No question.
Because that is a job killer. It's one thing, business people don't like taxes, but at least they know, okay, I'm going to pay this tax at this rate, and they may advocate to reduce taxes. That's fine. But they cannot stand it when they feel like they're wasting money on some regulatory burden that they know has no real impact on their business. That drives them crazy, and it also tends to be arbitrary because you have people in the administration, I'm not singling anybody out, but you have administrative personnel who are enforcing these regulations who may not always be consistent in how they do it.
You know, and again, I think you're right. I see it as a bipartisan issue as well. It becomes cumbersome, it becomes restrictive, it becomes costly. Whether you're the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, if you're mired in regulations and forms and permits and licenses, and they're confusing to begin with, on top of all that, nobody likes that, and that doesn't do anyone any good.
And I'll give you a couple of examples when I'm talking. My colleague, Representative Trillo's got, I think, 2 pieces of legislation in this year. One originated with our staff and one originated with Joe himself. They both have to do with the fire code. One of them has to do with the fact that there's a fee when you need to get a fire inspection done. That makes perfect sense. Okay, you're building a new building. You got to get the local fire department to come out, make sure you got proper fire protective devices.
Sure.
The cost, though, is based on the size of the building, when in reality, you know, let's face it, at a certain level, the cost of the fire installation and inspection is the same whether the building is, 500 square feet or 5,000. Why does the cost escalate with the size? It escalates out of proportion to any additional work. Well, that's a huge impact, and it's a huge detriment to people who are trying to build a larger facility. Second one he has in is a proposal to prevent inspections from having to be done repeatedly when a tenant moves out. I think the example he'll give is, let's say you have a hair salon, and one hair salon closes, another hair salon comes in. Well, you just had it inspected a year before. Why do you need another inspection? Nothing's changed. Those are little things, but the analogy I use is like barnacles on the ship. And when you're trying to open a business, and you have to deal with stuff like that, it's aggravating.
And Minority Whip Trillo is a small business person himself, and he's also working, it's my understanding, to promote more construction here in Rhode Island, and those kinds of jobs usually are better paying.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, actually, speaking of construction, one thing I'd like to see us return to is the historic tax credits.
Boy, yeah. We've talked about it a lot. Yeah. And when I first moved here to Rhode Island in 2006, they were in place, and we witnessed a lot of progress that was made here. And I interviewed the speaker recently about that. He agrees with you. He just thinks that there needed to be some tweaking of some of the language of the legislation, because the last time around, although it was very well intended, some folks maybe took advantage of the process.
Yeah, well, it's a funny thing, because in general, I do not like tax credits. I think lowering taxes across the board is the way to go, and that's because I generally don't like the government picking winners and losers. But I'm not an ideologue about this, and we've seen the historic tax credit have an impact. I live in the Blackstone Valley. I had a huge impact up there, not just in my town, but in Woonsocket, in Burriville, in North Smithfield, where I live, Smithfield. Huge impact, and it brings in construction work. The problem in the past, and I wasn't here at the time, but I know the problem in the past was, number one, the predictability for the hit on the budget each year was a little out of whack. They couldn't tell how much they were going to have to fund it. And number two, I guess there were people taking advantage of it, which is why, in general, I don't like tax credit programs.
They were selling the credits and all that stuff. But the principle, the idea, because we have so many spectacular buildings here.
Yeah, it's perfectly suited for Rhode Island. That's the thing. If we were, Wyoming, I don't know what it would do. But in Rhode Island, with all the old buildings we have, where factories have moved out, we've got these empty shells that are still in good condition, that can be reused. It's an incentive to get people, and we see what happens. If you don't have those credits, those projects do sit. So there's a cause and effect there.
You just made me think of something. Even with some of our challenges that we have here in the Ocean State, I certainly would rather live in Rhode Island than Wyoming. I just think we have a much more interesting place to live, a much more engaging, much more vibrant state. And we have so many things going for us.
Convenient to things, too.
Yeah, we have a great location. We have the tremendous, the marvelous oceanfront real estate. And it truly is. And I sometimes think we're our own worst enemy. We don't pat ourselves on the back enough as a state for all of the positive things that we offer our residents and business people.
Well, last weekend I was with my son for his birthday at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And in the American section, there was a painting on the wall. I saw it from a distance. It was a spectacular landscape painting, beautiful. I walked up to it, it was in Newport. So yes, the problem, of course, is we're not the only place in America with those assets. So when it comes to business development, we can't rely just on that.
Let's talk about some legislation that you specifically are working on. Tell our viewers about this change you'd like to see legislatures have to make with their own health insurance here.
Well, the Rhode Island Constitution mandates what legislators get paid. And we can have a debate all day long about how much legislators should be paid, whether they should be paid at all, et cetera. But it's set by the Constitution. It's set that way so it's not political. Mm-hmm. That way you cannot have, for example, any Speaker of the House decide that person's going to get paid less than that. You can't do that. Part of the compensation package is health insurance, but when that was enacted, health insurance was not the cost that it is now. And you think back 20, 30 years, it might have been a few $1,000s a year. Now it's $19,000, $20,000 a year. It's not what was anticipated. My issue is we cannot continue to advocate for, on the local level and at the state level, that state employees and public employees in general pay co-shares on insurance if we don't do the same. To me, it's a symbolic thing. It's not about the money, because the co-share, there's maybe 100 legislators total, roughly. I know it's 113. Let's say you have 100 legislators, and they each would pay $4,000. That's some significant money, but not everybody takes the health insurance and so on. But it's the principle. How can I go to people and say, yeah, you should negotiate a contract and get a 25% or a 20% copay when I'm not going to pay it myself? That's not fair.
Well, you certainly don't need a lobbyist like me, leader, but the salary for the General Assembly, I think a lot of people are surprised when they hear how low it is. We have what's called a part-time legislature, but I know from the stuff that we cover with Capital TV, the committees, the special commissions, the meetings of the General Assembly, the amount of hours that you folks put in, irrespective of party affiliation, they're long.
Well, that's
for a really nominal stipend, actually.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting philosophical question, because if you don't pay elected officials enough, there's some people that just won't run. They won't be able to run. There are people that literally do need the money here. I'm not one of them, but there are people that do need the salary they make here to make a living, and they would not be able to run for office. Other people don't need it. They might be retired and they might be doing very well. There's some people that are quite wealthy. They don't need it either. But you can't set a policy based on individual circumstances. You have to set it as, this is what we're going to pay our elected officials, and this is why. And maybe the sums that we get paid aren't quite right, but I'm not sure there's a correct answer to that question.
Well, if you were czar, and you could do it any way you want, should we one day maybe have a full-time state legislature?
No, because you will not. First of all, as someone who believes in limited government, the more we're in session, the more we have people up here doing stuff, the more chances we have to do things that are going to be detrimental to society. I don't want a full-time legislature. I also think that we will discourage certain people from running for office. The problem is, to make a truly full-time legislature, you need to pay people a lot of money to make it worth their while to give up their career. Because don't forget, you're getting elected every 2 years, and you're not going to give up your career, no matter what it is, to run for office in the middle of your career for 2 years, knowing your constituents could toss you out 2 years later and the other job you have may not be there. You can't do that.
I have a great deal of respect for the men and women who do run for office, and those that are successful and those that are unsuccessful, that get involved in the process. But for what, $13,000 or thereabouts?
Well, you don't do it for the money, that's the point.
But then your life comes under a great deal of scrutiny. You become subjected to people like me probing around, asking a lot of questions, and sometimes even your family members, et cetera, coming under the scrutiny of the press and the public, and and again, a lot of hours on top of it.
Yeah, but that's what you're getting into when you sign up for the job, so to speak. So you have to be able to put up with that. That's part of it. And I don't have any problem with the public scrutinizing the people we elect to a point. You don't have to investigate people's everyday private life. But when it comes to things that will affect their decision making, absolutely. You should know a little bit about the people you vote for.
We've been talking about the economy and revenue. You also have been working on some legislation that would suggest we get a larger percentage of the pie from Twin River Casino. Bring us up to speed on that, if you would, Leader.
Yeah, the long story short is when we passed the Twin River bill, and there was also a Newport grant component, but the Newport wasn't approved down Newport, so that's out of the mix. When we passed the Twin River bill last year and then the voters approved it, we, the legislature, set in statute a reimbursement rate for the money we would get. And I asked at the time, where did this number come from? Because based on the information that Twin River had given the Finance Committee, which I had in my possession, it looked like, based on their expenses and costs and so on, that there was a range of figures at which they would be able to stay in business, make money, et cetera. And my point was, as much as I hate this fact, even though Twin River is a private institution, because it's the third largest source, along with the rest of the lottery, of revenue for the state, we have a strong incentive to maximize what the state gets out of it. I mean, that's just the way it is. So I don't know why we weren't maximizing how much money we could get from Twin River. Again, I don't want to put them out of business. They're a private institution and so on. But we do control by statute what they earn. So why we're not maximizing it to the benefit of the taxpayers, I don't know. So I've put in a bill to up the take, so to speak, and we'll see what happens.
And what's the difference?
Well, right now the rate is 18%. I proposed 20%. If I recall, the figures they gave us last year, anything up to about 25% was within their profit margin. So it could be 19%, it could be 21%. Maybe 18 is the optimal number, but I never got a straight answer last year as to why 18 was the perfect number. I don't know what was wrong with 20. I don't know what's wrong with 17 or 22. I'd like to know. I want to hear an explanation for that.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. What kind of feedback are you getting from your colleagues?
Well, I had this as a floor amendment during the debate last year, and I'd be diplomatic. No one could give a straight answer on that either. It was voted down. It hasn't gotten a lot of attention yet because the Finance Committee is hearing all the budget articles now, and it's a finance bill. So I think it'll get a lot more attention later in the spring, and we'll see. I don't know why anyone, frankly, would oppose it, to be honest, but we'll see. I think it'll bring in, each percentage point we raise it brings in, I think, around $650,000 in tax revenue. That's the numbers I got from the fiscal staff. I'd have to check that number, but it's in that vicinity.
I heard from a source just this past weekend, Twin River had the OJs performing and world premiere, and their machines were at like a 95% capacity usage, which is an extremely high percentage. And, again, gaming is a big part of our revenue mix. But, we have maybe the landscape changing, especially when we talk about Massachusetts. that could affect that in the very near future.
It could, but their financial projections they gave us last year built in an assumption that they would lose revenue to Massachusetts over time. So the figures that I'm talking about were I'm talking about Twin River's own figures. That's why I'm at a loss to understand why it is we're not getting a little more out of them.
You know, I'll tell you something. I'm surprised because we've talked a lot in this state about gaming, and there was that whole issue about changing the state charter a few years ago when the Narragansett Indian tribe was working with the Harris folks to build a full-fledged casino. I've always wondered why nobody's ever even broached the topic of sports betting, why they haven't added that into the mix. I mean, we added table games at Twin River. We know that across the country there's millions and millions of dollars bet each week on sporting events that is going untaxed and really unmonitored.
I don't know if there's ever been a bill in about sports betting. I know I've heard some of my colleagues talk about it, in the past privately as something we ought to consider doing. Like I said, a lot of people are opposed to gambling in principle, and I don't like the fact that so much of our budget relies on gambling, but it is what it is. So if we're going to have a casino in Twin River, and it's going to be something that's a major contributor to state revenue, we need to protect it. And if sports betting would help maximize their ability to compete, then that's something we would definitely look at.
I'll never forget, too, when I first visited, the very first time I ever had the opportunity to visit Mohegan Suns in Foxwoods, and I'm not a big bettor by any stretch of the imagination. I'm a penny ante kind of gambler. But I was surprised at the parking facility, the number of Rhode Island license plates I saw there. And I'm thinking, my goodness, that money's going to another state. If people are going to have the propensity to gamble, I'd certainly like it to stay here in our state so that we could reap the benefit of that.
Well, true. Of course, Mohegan Sun and Foxwoods are closer to Summer Islanders than Twin River is, but the real issue is a lot of Massachusetts residents come to Twin River, and we want them to continue to come to Twin River instead of going somewhere else.
We talked about business regulation, about making it easier to do business a little earlier, Leader Newberry. What about this, you're co-sponsor of a bill that was offered up by Representative Jay Edwards about going through all kinds of laws in our state that are seemingly outdated that we need to revise.
The Office of the Repealer. It's a
yeah,
great title,
the Office of the Repealer.
Jay got that idea from, I like to say, the Republicans in Kansas have that law in place, and he was in touch with a Kansas legislator about this. And they have an office whereby the general public can give ideas, because let's face it, I mean, people in certain industries are going to know what laws don't apply or shouldn't apply anymore. And they give suggestions into the Office of the Repealer, and that office, as I understand the way it works, makes recommendations to the legislature saying, this ought to be gotten rid of, and here's why. In other words, they do a lot of the grunt work, so to speak, and allow us to make the final decision. That's the theory. And I think it's a great idea.
You know, it is a great idea. And again, it would streamline the business process because we have a lot of these abstract things on the books that that maybe have no relevance to our culture, our society, our way of doing business in 2013, and they ought to be repealed.
Oh yeah, one thing that I was always fighting for, and we finally got rid of it in 2011, as a minor example, was the whole idea of having to publish school committee notices in newspapers. That made sense 50 years ago.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
That's a great example because our society is changing. Schools save money. People are online now. It made perfect sense. That was a perfect example. Minority Leader Brian Newberry, you're always gracious to come on the show. You always are very cooperative with us. And for that, we're extremely grateful. I wish you, and not only your Republican caucus, but all of your colleagues in the House of Representatives the very best.
No, anytime. Thank you very much.
And of course, we could not do it without you. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Dave Barber. And remember, you heard it straight from the Gavel.